Welcome to Canard Boulevard. My name is Scott, and this is my Nosegear Omnibus, where I find a few little problems in my Nosegear that quickly escalates into a major project. And before we get to that, let's get this out of the way. Nosegear is off and ready to be overhauled. It definitely needs it. I did find a couple of issues. This NG3 bracket here was loose. This bolt was finger tight, very bad. However, the main pivot, smooth bearing in bushing, very good shape, so I'm happy about that, so that doesn't have to be replaced. This cover obviously will come off. This will get refloxed, and I'm gonna actually get a new one because this one's actually been kind of worn because where the actuator was coming down was actually contacting it. You can see it's worn away there and it's actually kind of sharp. So I'm gonna file that down, smooth that off, round it out a bit. And this obviously then needs to get replaced because it's worn from many years of being contacted. The free play that I found was because this is the wrong size bolt. Not only was that just finger tight on there, that's a 1/4 inch bolt, and the bushing is that it goes through here is a 1964. So when I get the new replacement brackets here, I'll drill them slightly larger, use a larger bolt, and that will solve that loose play issue. I have a new fork assembly arriving, I think in a day or two. So this will all get replaced. This comes off. You can see it's actually already pretty much taken itself off. So this will come off. We'll reflox this in, reflox on the new one here, and then reapply the cover on here and bond it in properly. And that should be it for the Nosegear. I did extend the Nosegear actuator out, and I did find that little bent piece up in there, and it's a lot better than I was hoping it was going to be. I don't think I'm going to have to replace anything. The bent bracket is so minor that I think I can bend that back with no problem at all, and that will be fixed. So that's not an issue at all. All right, so this is the point where I realize, wow, there's a lot more wrong here than I originally thought. I pulled that strut off, and where the NG3, NG4 bracket had slid down, it had actually structurally damaged the strut to the point where that strut was no longer able to be used. So I decided we need to scrap this and start from scratch, create a brand new strut with brand new parts. So I went home and started ordering parts. The first thing I ordered was a brand new strut. I got the strut, and it needs to be formed and cut to size because it's actually a universal strut for several different aircraft, and I got to work. So I have cut the strut to length, and when I did, I had a look at the offcut, and there was a hole showing a void right there, and you can actually see the void carried through right to the very end there. And I thought, wow, that void is it's significant. So I pushed a wire into it to see just how far the void goes, and it goes up, well, it's almost 3 inches there, I'd say. Yeah, just about almost 3 inches. That void continues up inside the strut. So I thought, oh, I may have to reject this strut. Then I started thinking about it, and actually I don't think it's going to be an issue because that portion of the strut, that 3-inch portion, is not it's not under stress. It's not being bent because it is firmly clamped and floxed into this piece here. So just like that. Oh, it's like this. So it gets clamped in there. So there's no bending inside the strut at that point. The part with the void is entirely surrounded and floxed in by this piece here. So I'm going to say that inclusion or that void there is acceptable. Otherwise, if it was down anywhere else in it, I'm going to have a really good look to make sure if there's anywhere else I would have rejected this, but I think we're going to be good. The next thing we have to do is wrap the strut in 2 layers of BID, and that is because the strut is made of pressed fibers that are very long and strong. However, they need to be constrained so that if the strut is under stress, it can't split apart. So by putting very, very strong wraps of bid around it, that prevents that from happening. So you can see I put some epoxy down on the strut and I'm wetting out this layer of bid, and then we will let that cure once I've pushed it into place. And that allows, on the 3 sides that I've just now covered, those 3 sides will be covered with a bid layer of epoxy that is incredibly strong, and I put some Peel Ply on top because we will be bonding more to this.
3 hours later.
So I've got this nice heated curing table that does a full cure of the epoxy in just 3 hours, so I can speed this along. We can pull off the Peel Ply from this and then try to separate it from the wood that I used as a prop to stand it up on. Kind of hoping that it hasn't completely bonded to the wood, but let's pull off the Peel Ply. So to remove this, I first need to cut the fiberglass away because it's got epoxy in there, so it's very, very strong. And now that I've done that, I've got the wood away. Now I'm going to start cutting a little bit of the leftover fiberglass there, and now we will grind away the sharp edge of fiberglass. As you can see, I'm just using a grinder just to take away the little bit of very, very sharp fiberglass bid that is got the epoxy in it that's sticking out just over the edge. Otherwise, that sharp layer there would cut through the next layer of bid. So now that I've cut that away, we'll sand it down. Did I sand it down? Yeah, we'll have to sand it down to give it nice and smooth, nice, because this is going to get covered up forever. So we don't want any kind of sharp edge in there. Clean it up with some virgin acetone. And now we will once again do another layup, but this time we're going to do it on the front side. So first we did the back side, and then we did the front side, or is it the front side and the back side? One or the other. In any case, so now that we've done the first 3 sides, now we're doing another 3 sides, which we'll end up with 2 layers of bid on the sides of the strut and 1 each on the front. But the whole idea is that this is now extremely strong. It's got this bid wrap laid up and epoxied in place around it to support the strut when it gets stressed and bent, and to prevent those fibers from separating apart. So now I've got the cure completed on the second layer of bid here. So I will once again trim away all the excess that doesn't need to be there. I did make a mistake here in that I didn't trim enough and it folded over underneath, and now I've got to pull that up and trim and sand that away. Not a huge mistake, but it just meant that this took a little bit extra work to clean up after the fact. So some sanding, again, want to make it nice, smooth, and even surface to work with here. And now that we have the strap wrapped in 2 layers of bid, we need to prepare the end of the strut for where the pivot is actually going to go. There was a little bit of a void in there. You can see I'm sanding that out to make sure that it gets filled properly. That'll get filled with flocks when we put the pivot on. So here's the pivot, and I'm just fitting that to have a look and see how it's actually going to fit in there along with the clamp. The thickness of the end has to be consistent because the clamp and the pivot need to be parallel to one another. So I do need to do a little bit of build up here to fix that. So a quick explanation of what I'm doing here. This piece goes in here like this, and then this piece goes on top. And this needs to be parallel to this piece. In order for that to happen, this edge here has to be parallel with this edge here. That is not the case in mine. It's actually wider at this side than it is on this side. Now some of them is actually narrower here and thicker here, and you have to build it up this way, but mine is actually this way. So I've got to, I take some measurements, and it's about 0.1 inch difference between this side and this side. And so that equates to about 3, I'm going to say 4. I'll do 4 layers of bid across here. And they're going to be, so it's 4 here and then 3, 2, 1. So it'll gradually build up. And that will make it thicker this way, and once that's cured we can sand it and form it and make sure that it's actually level again. So I'm going to cut that now. I'm going to lay about 4 inches in, actually. And even though this is here is just about 2.5 inches, I have cut, well, I'm going to actually have cut 5, but I wanted to actually cut closer to 4. So we'll trim that. I wanted it right about there. So the first one we'll lay up just, actually the first one we'll do right across. Just give us a nice even base. So those will be our layers that we're going to be putting on there. This is actually kind of like sculpting. So you take the materials that you're building with, which in this case is epoxy and glass fiber, and you're just laying it up and putting it in and looking at it and seeing where do you need to put some more and laying that up. Now I've got some Peel Ply on there, and that should take care of it. And once that's cured, we'll take that Peel Ply off, and then we'll take some measurements, see how it looks. So it looks pretty even to me. So then we're going to sand all the edges down and make sure it tapers nicely so that it's a nice smooth transition and that the two ends are perfectly parallel and even, and they measured perfectly. All right, so I've laid up a little bit extra BID layers on here, so you can probably see that it's now more. I put some on this side and not so much on this side, and the end result is that these two sides here are now parallel within 1/100th of an inch, which is more than good enough because it's actually going to be put in here with flocks. So the flocks will account for that a little bit extra deviance. I will admit this is a little bit nerve-wracking building this thing because there are so many different steps in here where if you screw up anything, the whole thing is ruined. And this is one of them where you're taking measurements and you have to make sure that the strut is absolutely perfectly perpendicular to the pivot. Otherwise, it won't retract properly into the airplane. It simply won't fit into the area in which it's supposed to retract into. So I'm taking measurements to find the exact center of both the pivot and the clamp, and then I'm doing the same thing for the strut to find its exact center. I'm going to put some straight lines down on this piece of paper here and make sure that I have some perpendicular lines there, and I will check that with a laser just to make sure that I did get the perpendicular lines exactly perpendicular. And now we're going to, once I've sanded the metal pieces, because we are going to flux this in here in a moment, we're going to put some threaded rod into that pivot so that we have a nice long arm that we can make sure that the pivot is exactly perpendicular once we fit it onto the strut. So I'm going to do a dry fit here to make sure that everything looks good. We got cleaned everything up with some acetone. And here comes the sanity check. We're basically going to do exactly what we're going to do when we actually flux it in place, but we're going to just do a dry run to make sure everything fits. And while I have some epoxy made up, I'm going to inject some into the end in that little void just to fill that void up so that you don't have a problem with that. Paint some epoxy on the strut and on the pivot. And now I'm adding some flocked cotton to the rest of the epoxy to create some flocks. And we'll paint that both onto the pivot and onto the strut itself. Clamp that in place. And make sure that everything is perfectly parallel. We're going to check and check and check to make sure that the strut itself and the pivot are perpendicular to one another. All right. Let's see if my clamps come off. Good, they do. Here's my, look at that. Kind of epoxied everything to everything else. But there's what the Flox applesauce looks like when it's cured. I did have a little bit of squeeze out there and through the holes, so I'll have to clean that up, but overall looks good. All right, next step. All right, a little bit of flox squeeze out that needs to be cleaned up. I'll just test the clamp on there, and then I'll just grind away where that flox has cured in place where it doesn't need to be. The next thing we're going to do is then put that clamp in place on the back, clamp it there, and then go over to the drill press and drill through the clamp into the top. So we got to make sure it's exactly the right place, clamp it there, and then drill with the drill press through into the bottom piece. So we're going to drill 4 holes into the strut itself, and you can see me there drilling that. So now I get my fasteners out, ready to clamp it in place, and guess what? They don't fit. The fasteners are not long enough, and I quickly realized that I measured the fasteners from my old strut, not the new one. The old one's thinner than this one, so now I've got a problem. So while I'm waiting for the fasteners to fit the NG6, the correct length ones, I'm going to work on installing the NG3 and NG4. These are stainless ones that came from Jack Wilhelmsen. Couple issues. My right nose gear actuator actually has a 5/16 rather than a 1/4 inch hole for the actuator bolt. That was a problem with the old one because there was a 1/4 inch bolt. This had a 1/4 inch, but the actuator was 5/16, and as a result it was whacking back and forth when it was extending and retracting. So to solve that, I'm going to drill this out to 5/16 so that I can put in a 5/16 bolt, and that will solve that issue. Also, I noticed that the finishing on some of these drill points is not the absolute best. You can see there's a lot. I don't know if you can see. You can see in there. So I'm just gonna, with a large drill bit, just to chamfer that all away. I'm not actually going to put a bolt through the center of the strut, so I'm not even going to use these holes that are drilled in there. So I don't really care, but I do want them not to have bits of metal hanging off like that, so we'll fix that. So I'm going to drill the holes, or actually enlarge the holes in the NG4. I got some tap fluid in there to keep it cool and lubricated, otherwise the stainless steel will heat up and work harden, and in that case it's almost impossible to drill. You can see it is getting hot, but not enough to actually work harden it. Okay, next I'm going to fit the NG3 and NG4 onto the strut, but the position from the pivot has to be absolutely exact, because this is the geometry that determines how far the leg is actually going to extend out and retract. So if you get this wrong, it's not going to work properly. So I did a lot of measurements, drew on exactly where I wanted to go. Now I'm going to do a test fit, got all my clamps in place so that when I do flux it in place, I know the clamping system is going to work. Okay, that's all going to work. So let's scuff it up so we can get the epoxy to adhere to both the metal and the strut. Clean it up with acetone, and now I'm going to mix up some resin, and some epoxy resin will paint both the parts and the strut itself. Add some flock cotton to create some flocks, and we'll spread the flocks on all the various parts. Get the various pieces installed correctly, put the clamps on as we had planned, and then put it aside to cure. Okay, coming off, it looks good. All the clamps came off great, and we'll sand a little bit of epoxy squeeze out just to make sure everything is nice and smooth. Now, the original plan had you drilling through the strut to hold this in place. I don't want to do that. That will weaken the strut at a very critical spot. So I'm not going to do that. So after I'm finished cleaning off all the extra flocks here that squeezed out, what I'm going to do is something that Mark Zeitlin recommended, and that is to build up layers of BID on the top and the bottom of this piece, and that will lock that piece in place and prevent it from actually ever moving up and down. So you can see I've cut various different widths of BID. I'm going to paint some epoxy around the strut there and just start adding layers, and then I'll taper it so it gets thinner as it goes farther away from the bracket, and then as it gets right up close to the bracket, it's so thick that it's actually equal to the thickness of the bracket. So that bracket is basically encased in BID and epoxy. It is not going anywhere. It can't move because the epoxy is holding it from moving up or down. And we'll just add layer after layer after layer until we have the proper thickness that actually matches the thickness of the bracket itself. And you can see that I'm adding thinner and thinner strips as they get closer so that the buildup is gradual from the outer edge of the strut going inwards towards that bracket. Now I've got that finished, and we'll get some Peel Ply on there just to give it a nice surface, because we do want to make sure that we can bond to this in the future, and put it to cure. Taking it apart, it looks good. We'll pull the Peel Ply off, and it looks pretty good. I checked the width just against the other strut, and now we're going to just sand things smooth a bit. The metal is still exposed. There's a little bit of just squeeze out on there, but I do want to put one more layer of BID on here that is going to cover both the strut and the sides of the metal, just to give a nice, consistent, even surface that it'll look good, and there won't be any strange ridges. So I'm using my cardboard aided design here. I'm cutting some paper to fit the shape of the epoxy I want. I'm also going to bond on the MKNG 15 at the bottom there as well, which is what holds the wheel on. So I'm basically showing exactly where that's going to go and where I need to fit it. However, I realized fairly quickly that the bottom of my strut is too big to fit in there. So I've got to start sanding it down to get it to taper enough to fit into that. And it took a fair bit of carving and sanding just to get all the different dimensions correct to get it to fit. So now it's working correctly. I've got it tapered down exactly right. We'll sand those, get it ready to flux in place. And there goes you can also see the foot on there that's going to clamp in place. So we're just doing a dry fit here with my fasteners just to make sure that it's going to work. And do I have the correct size fasteners this time? No, I don't. Well, let's get back to the MKNG 3 and 4, and I'll test on my BID that I cut. It looks good. We'll go ahead and get some epoxy on there mixed up and start painting it on. Then we'll get the BID on there, wet it out, press it in place, make sure we squeeze out any excess, and then we can Peel Ply this. I don't know if we are going to Peel Ply it. So we'll put on a Peel Ply layer and get it ready and set it aside to cure. Okay, it's another day. We're going to peel off the Peel Ply. Check it out. Looks good. And then we'll sand it down, make it nice and smooth, because this is going to be the finish layer. We're just basically going to prime and paint on top of this. So we want it to be smooth and nice to look at and nice to feel. So we're going to take some extra time here just to make sure that we have a nice, smooth transition. All right, now we're going to both clamp the pivot side as well as get the foot in place, the MKNG 15 along with its foot. So now we've got the correct fasteners because our aircraft spruce order has arrived. So we've got correct size fasteners for the pivot end as well as for the foot end. And now we're just going to test all that to make sure it looks good, get them in place, and start painting. Well, we'll start with sanding and cleaning, and then we'll paint things up after we do another quick test just to make sure it's going to look good. All right, so we'll paint things up with epoxy just to make sure that the ends look good and are nice and clean. Now we will mix up our flux, applying some flux to both the clamp and the strut itself, and torquing those up. Not too tight yet, just tighten it just enough that we don't want to squeeze out all the flux. We want some flux in there, and we're going to do the exact same thing on the bottom. Put flux in there, both surfaces, just tighten it down. Not too tight, not hand tight, but enough that you don't want to squeeze out all the flux. You want to have flux bonding around both those pieces to physically bond the metal pieces to the strut itself. And then we'll set it aside to cure. Always amazes me just how hard this stuff is once it's cured. It's like steel. I mean, literally, the stick breaks rather than dislodging out of the cured flux. And now that everything is cured, I'll get the torque wrench out and we'll torque these fasteners to the correct torque value, because remember, they were just snugged up for the cure. So now that we have everything in place the way it's going to be, we want those fasteners to be torqued correctly. I went to test out mounting the wheel in here. I did test originally when I first got these forks that the wheel would fit properly in there, and the distance is perfect, so it's great. So then I put the wheel in there, and then I put my bolt through, and I'm like, oh, well, that's not right. And I thought, okay, well, let's try it the other way. Yeah, that's not very good.
So I thought, well, maybe one of these fork faces or these fork ends has gotten twisted. So I measured between here, 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 you know, several places around here, and it's all identical. So these surfaces are parallel, and then I put the bolt through and then took a scale and measured the angle here, and it's 91.8 degrees, and that's on both sides. So both of these holes have been drilled inaccurately, such that they don't line up properly with one another. As you can see, when you push the bolt through, because this hole is not drilled perpendicular to the fork face, it causes it not to line up at the other side. I don't really want to just drill these holes out to fix that, but I may end up having to do that. Alright, so what I'm going to try and do to fix this is to simply drill the hole. So I'll put this one in and drill this way. Shouldn't take much. Alright, that's all it took for that one. Same on this one. All right, that looks like it's solved that issue. And now I've got some cobalt drill bits here that are specially designed for drilling metal. And they're very, very hard, so they're good for drilling stainless steel. They're a very flat face on them so that they don't skip around and don't wallow out an oval shaped hole. So the trick here is that the hole on NG4 on the inside is drilled, but the hole on the outside that matches up with it is not drilled. And we have to drill through there, lining up with the one on the inside so that we can drill through properly. And we have to do that without reference to, can't see it. So I'm just going to do a bunch of measurements to transfer the measurements of this hole hopefully to the outside, and then I'll drill a pilot hole through there to make sure that what I think is correct is in fact correct, and hopefully everything will be fine, and I'll just drill right through and everything will be wonderful.
This is something that I was really not looking forward to because it's really easy to screw this up, and if you screw this up, man, there's a lot of stuff you got to take apart, and then I'd have to order new NG3 and NG4s, which takes weeks. And I mean, this whole thing has taken months already. You can't really tell because I've put this whole video together to do it short, but man, this thing took a long time to build because I had to keep ordering parts and waiting for cures. So now I'm using my nice cobalt bit here to drill through the stainless steel of the NG3. And of course, that then goes right through into the NG4 and through. So now I will put it through, test it, make sure it lines up, and just clean up the burrs with a file. All right, today we're going to do a test fitting of the new landing gear strut, among other things, just to make sure that it fits and take some measurements when it's retracted so that I can start working on the cover that goes on top and get it finished. But before I start that, I noticed that one of these switches, the outlimit switch, I had to actually fix the connector on the end because the wire had actually come out of that connector. So I've done that. Now I've fixed it, and I'm just going to test both the up and down limit switches to make sure that the gear is stopping correctly and those switches are working correctly. Now, it's time to test fit that landing gear, the nose gear. This is really, really hard to do by yourself because you have to push a bolt through from up above while trying to hold the gear leg at the exact correct position where the holes in the pivot line up with the holes in the fuselage. You really need two people to do this. This was so frustrating. I almost gave up on this a couple of times because it was so hard to do. But after just, you can see I'm trying to prop it up in a few different ways and trying to figure out how to get it shoved up there. Now I've got it through. The pivot is correct. However, the actuator doesn't fit between the NG3 and NG4. I'm looking at it and thinking, what is wrong? Okay, well, and also I noticed that it doesn't retract properly. When I push it up there, it's not actually fitting correctly. So I'm going to take some measurements here and take some pictures and try to figure out how I'm going to solve these problems. I had a lot of trouble getting the pivot screw up in there. You can see where it comes through, and I had to get it lined up with the gear. That was a bit of a challenge. So that was the first issue. The second issue is on the actuator here. This is the correct width. This is 1 inch here. However, I've got an extra 0.05, so 50,000th on either side of that bushing. If this did not have the bushings on there, it would fit perfectly into there. However, with those bushings, I'm off and I don't have enough room. It doesn't physically fit in there. I don't really want to bend these. It's going to crack all the fiberglass, and but that may be what I have to do. And I think part of the issue is that this is a much stronger NG3, NG4 assembly, so the metal is physically thicker. And it's, as a result, this is much narrower in here, and there's not enough room. I was thinking maybe I could press these bushings out, but they are brass bushings, and that's really what is giving the surface a hard surface, so it doesn't wear away at this aluminum here. So I don't really want to take the bushings out. And I do need to get a washer in there as well. So, I'm not quite sure what the answer to this is yet. I'm going to have to think about that. The other issue is that on the top of mine, it is thicker, I think, than the old one. And as a result, once I had it connected up into the pivot in there, it was actually hitting this piece right here. So I'm going to have to trim this back, and I measured it and I have 0.7 inches. So I've got quite a bit of room, but this opening here, I'm going to have to trim it back maybe 1/2 inch to get the landing gear to fit in there when it's retracted. So not a tire failure. I didn't get it to retract, which is what I was hoping to do today, but we'll get there. So I've been taking some measurements. The width of the strut itself is slightly larger than on the old one. My old one is 1.11. The new one is 1.19 in thickness, so 0.08 of an inch thicker, which isn't a huge amount. And then I took some measurements from the center of the hole to the top of the clamp, and on both. The old one is 2.587, the new one's 2.74, so it's about 0.15 inches thicker, which isn't a huge amount, but apparently it's enough to allow interference there. But I think probably the most telling issue is that my old strut, I didn't even notice this until now, the old strut was actually fluxed in place without straightening these two pieces. They're not parallel like they're supposed to be. If you look at the distance here, at this end here is 0.71, and then down at this end it's 0.57, whereas on this one it's equal all the way across like it's supposed to be. And the result is that it's much thinner at this end, unlike this one, which is constant across. So it basically means that I've got interference between this edge here. Actually, the one other thing is that the beveled edge here, the angled edge, is a slight bit larger than it is on this one. So I do have a problem here with this corner interfering with that lip piece in the gear well. I can't really do anything about this here. I do have 0.7 inches of that overhang. I mean, that's a relatively huge amount. If I trim away even half of that, I should get the clearance. So unfortunately, I don't have a lot of visibility into the interference when it's installed. So what I think I'm going to have to do is just bring a Dremel tool, make a cut, trim some away, fit the gear leg, make a cut, take it out if it doesn't fit, do it again over and over again. As for this is a real problem. Here's my old one, which you can see is 1.136 inches, and the new one is 1.03. So I talked with Mark Zeitlin again. He's a really great guy, really helpful, and he suggested, just grind off the outsides of those bushings. It'll be fine, and I think I agreed with him. So I went ahead and did that. I also ground down the bottom edge where it was contacting the other one, and now I've polished it up, measured it, looks perfect. It looks like it will fit properly, and now I am going to grind that lip at the very top to create the clearance needed for this new gear leg. This time I used some help. I had my neighbor friends come over to help with it, and it took no time at all. So now I've got the gear installed, and I've got it definitely fits with the actuator properly. You can see, and I got it retracting. And I did need to change the up limit switch position because the strut's slightly larger than the old one, but it definitely worked. And you can see I disconnected it. I'm going to reconnect it after I've adjusted the switch, and it definitely retracts properly and extends properly. So that's great. The clearance is correct at that lip at the front, and the down and up limit switches are working perfectly. The actuator is working perfectly. So I'm very pleased with this. It retracts into the correct place, and now that when it's retracted, I'm going to take a whole bunch of measurements to determine the distance between when the thing is retracted and the outside skin, because I need to bond the front cover to it with a spacer so that it is flush against the outside skin. All right, so now just to clean up on the grinding at the very front lip. Back home. Okay, now we can put the wheel on, but the spacers in the middle of the wheel were a little too large, and as a result, there was too much free play in the bearings, and so the wheel itself could actually move around on the bearings, and the grease would leak out from the bearing seals. So I basically, you can see I tested it there. They weren't quite enough. I took it apart again. All I'm doing is just taking those aluminum spacers that were machined, and I'm just taking a tiny bit off on the insides of both of them so that they're a little bit shorter. You can see I was using a micrometer to determine exactly how much was coming off. Now we'll give it another try, put it in there, tighten it up, test for free play, and there's no free play. It's perfect. Okay, now I'm going to degrease. Well, actually, I did degrease the wheel already, and I've got new bearings to put in because those old bearings, because there was so much free play, the seals were just destroyed. So I'm putting some new grease into those bearings. We'll get the spacers into those bearings once they're installed, which is pretty tough because the clearance between the two is almost zero. It's a very tight fit between them. Once they're in, it's great, but it does take a little bit of work to get them there. So now that I've got those both installed, we'll put the wheel in the forks, tighten it up, and torque it correctly. And I got a castle pin with a cotter pin, a castle nut with a cotter pin, and we'll also adjust those the Belleville washers on there for the correct tightness now that I have the wheel in, and put a cotter pin there as well. Next, we're going to remove the cover from the old strut. And it is actually mostly removed, but already because it's cracked off. But it's been repaired multiple times with different types of epoxy, so it's kind of a mess. And it took a bit of grinding and prying, and there's some of that epoxy repair got into the foam that was underneath, which means the foam had sucked up that epoxy. It was really kind of a mess. So I really had to spend quite a bit of time just grinding, and you can see I'm getting rid of the foam that's epoxied onto the backside of that cover there. And then some of that has actually got epoxy in it. You can see what's remaining there. So I have to grind away the epoxy, and the epoxy that did soak into the foam has left a weird kind of surface on the back there, so I've got to grind that all smooth. I've got to get the cover itself a consistent thickness across, a little bit of paint on there as well that needs to come off. So I basically want to have this fresh cover so that I can just mount it onto the new strut as it needs to be, and that will be good to go. I am actually removing some of scuffing the paint because I'm going to repaint that cover as well. Now I've cut some foam, and I need to size that foam, or actually taper it down to match the measurements, the depth measurements that I took when I had this on the airplane. So you can see I'm sanding the foam to taper it down to match the measurements at different lengths along the strut. The idea being that once that is in place and the cover is on top, when the gear is fully retracted, the cover itself will be flush with the outside fuselage all along its length. So that's glued on there for testing now. And back to the hangar. Very fortunately, had neighbors nearby to help get that pivot bolt in there again. That's pretty tough to do on your own. So you can see I've got the cover on with the foam spacing it out and retract it. And oh, what's going on here? The cover is pushed out too far. So I'm going to strip all that foam off there and have a look and see what's going on. And realize actually it fits better with no foam on there. So I've got the cover on there and making sure it's lined up properly. Going to mark it so I know the exact position of where it should go, and test it up and down a few more times. And then that's it. We'll take it back off the airplane, which is a lot easier to do on your own than it is putting it on by yourself. And then we'll tie the plane down with a safety strap and prop it back up to go home. So I went out to the airport and set up the strut with the foam that I had glued on there and measured to get the distance that I need from this cover from the strut. And it turned out I didn't need to do any of that, because what I didn't realize was when I took those initial measurements, I did not have the tire on. I just had the strut. Because I had just the strut and it didn't go all the way up, because there's less room than I had realized for the tire to actually fit up there. So when this strut retracts and the tire actually makes contact with the inside of the wheel well, at that point, the cover was actually still pushed outside of the aircraft. So what I did was I took the cover off and scraped away the foam that I had glued on there and put it on there without any of the foam, and it was perfect. So when I put the cover right against the strut, the spacing is dead on. So I don't need any foam or any spacing at all. So that was just an exercise in wasted time. That said, it does need to be adjusted this way. You can see I put marks on here so that I can put exactly where I want the strut to be glassed on. And I am going to have to take this bit off here, because that obviously will not allow it to sit flush. It'll end up pushing up at the end. So I'll grind this away, and then we'll get it placed in place where it needs to be, and then glass it in place. And that should be it for this strut. So let's get to work. We are really on the home stretch now, so I am sanding and using some acetone to take off the remainder of the adhesive that I had used to glue the foam on there that we no longer need, and then we'll clean up the rest of the thing with some acetone as well. I'm going to cut off that little piece on the end that we no longer need, because the cover is going to go flat onto the strut. So I'm going to position it on there, and the next thing I want to do is make sure that all the clamps I have are going to work properly and hold it in place the way I want to when I actually have it bonded in place. So kind of a dry run. So now that I know I have all the clamps ready to go, I'm going to mix up some epoxy and some flux, and we'll paint the both the cover and the strut with some epoxy, and then I'm going to spread some flux on both actually, I think I just put it on the strut, not on the cover. So yes, a little bit of flux. I didn't want too much because it's just going to squeeze out anyway. So I clamped it in place, cleaned up any flux that had squeezed out at the edge there. I didn't want too much. I mean, I don't mind if it's in there a little bit, but I didn't want too much going out everywhere. All right, that's cured. We're going to pull off the clamps and inspect it. It looks pretty good. So the next step is we want to add some micro in there and put some bid layers on. So I'm going to mix up some epoxy and some micro balloons, which you see my little bag there. And I'm going to use those micro balloons, make up that micro, and it's kind of like a creamy, thick whipped cream consistency, just to fill in that corner there, because I want to have a nice radius, because the bid won't go into a corner like that. You want to have it bend gently around that radius. So that's what I'm doing there with the micro. Then I paint some epoxy on there and lay my first layer of bid, then wet it out. And then once that's done, we'll put a Peel Ply on there as well. That's ready to cure, so we'll leave it to set. All right, I forgot to hit record when I pulled the Peel Ply off, but here we are doing the second layer of bid. I painted some epoxy on there, and now I'm wetting out the second layer of bid. And I actually ran out of epoxy. I was trying to be stingy with it. I didn't mix quite enough, so I had to mix up just a little bit more. And we'll wet that out, then get the Peel Ply on there, get that all solid in place, and let it cure. Boy, we're getting really close now. So now I'm going to peel off that Peel Ply. We get the nice layer underneath, and now we have to cut off all that flashing, all that extra glass that on the edge that we don't need. So I'll first cut it off, and then I'll take a grinder and get it a little bit closer. The cutting wheel is really dangerous to getting close because you can accidentally slip, but the grinder is a little more forgiving. So I'll get even closer with the grinder, and then once we've finished with that, then I'll go in with the sander, and that gives it a nice even edge, and you can't really make a mistake with a sander. So I'm going to go over, and you can see I went through a lot of sandpaper with this strut, so now I'm sanding pretty much everything that I can get to with the mechanical sander, with the electric sander, and then there's lots of little nooks and crannies in here that I can't get to with that. So once I finish with the electric sander, I start doing the rest by hand. You can see I've got I'm just getting into every little nook and cranny where there are sharp edges or some bumps or any inconsistency that needs to be cleaned up on that fiberglass that's cured. And this is the final sanding before paint. So I want to make sure that this is really a really good finish, a really good surface that's going to look good. And now we're going to clean up all that dust off there with some acetone and make sure everything's ready and prepped. And then we'll put on some tape so we don't have paint going anywhere we don't want paint to be, primarily on all the aluminum bits. And once that tape is finished, we'll then prop it up and get out the primer for the first layer of primer. This stuff takes a lot of mixing. It settles out really quickly. This is UV protective primer specifically for this purpose, and it will protect the fiberglass from degradation from the UV from the sun.
Okay, I didn't bother recording it because it's just boring to watch, but I did put 4 coats over the last couple of days of primer on here. And now we will cover up the rest of this so the final top coats don't go everywhere.
All right, for the top coats, I am using an epoxy spray paint. I'm doing a little bit of just scuffing here with a Scotch-Brite and then final cleanup with some acetone to clean up any dust. And then I'm doing 6 very light coats rather than any kind of thick coat, which is what they advise for this paint. They want you to do up to 6 coats within 1 hour with 10 minutes waiting for dry in between individual coats. So that's what I'm doing here. And I am doing some inspection as I go to make sure that I have full coverage and there's not any thin spots or spots that I've missed. And once this is done, I have to let it sit and cure for 48 hours. So let's do that now. All right, we have 5 coats of paint on there. It's cured, so time to take the paint off. I am cutting against the tape so it doesn't lift any of the paint that may not be cured. And now it's out to the airport with my daughter as an assistant to help get the strut installed. This is really, really tough to do. because you have to have the strut up there with 2 washers, and there's only about 0.02 inches of clearance to get everything all up in there. And then you have to hold the strut up and the 2 washers and get the holes aligned, and then have her push the bolt through. So it took quite a bit of a trial and error to get it in there. This is not a fun thing to do. But after a while, we did manage to get it in there. And so now I'm hooking up the actuator, and we'll give it a retract test. Now, this is the first retract test with the cover bonded in place. And I'm having her move the strut up and down while I'm checking it. And I did find that there was a little bit of interference on the left side, maybe maybe 0.5 millimeter, not much. So I thought, well, I'll just try to cut that down a bit, but it wasn't enough. So I decided I'll take the Dremel tool out, and I'm just going to scribe it down the whole side there. And that will give me the clearance that I need once the paint is back on there. So I've tested that, and it looks good. Now we have to repaint where I just sanded off the paint on the side of that cover. So one last go over with the sandpaper, make sure it's nice and smooth. We'll wipe it clean. And then we got to tape off everything that we don't want to paint. And I put 4 coats of that exact same epoxy paint on and let it cure. Wow, can you believe it? This started out as just a simple little spruce up the nose gear, get the cover on there bonded properly, make it look nice again. That, I thought maybe a week or 2 at the outset. Actually, it turned out to be several months because I had to rebuild it from scratch, as you've seen. But now it's installed. Everything is perfect. It fits perfectly, it's lined perfectly, the cover fits perfectly, it retracts perfectly, everything is good as new. Actually, it's better than new because I have all these new components that are much stronger than the old ones. I actually do have one more upgrade coming from the nose gear. I do have a new tire and tubes arriving soon, so we'll replace that. But for now, it's airworthy, it works, suspension works, retraction works, everything works. I'm so excited. The only thing left to do is the propeller. We'll take the prop off. The new one is in a box over there, brand new Kato prop. That'll be maybe an hour or 2 just to make sure everything's perfectly right. Then a whole lot of test flying just to make sure everything that I've done over the winter to the airplane is good. And then off to Sun and Fun. I've never been to Sun and Fun before. I'm really looking forward to it, so I hope to see you there. Those of you who've stuck through this entire epic video, I really appreciate you. I love all the great comments I get. If you have any questions or comments, do leave them in the comment section below. And if you could, please click like on this video and subscribe to the channel. If you like Canards, if you like flying, if you like maintenance, if you like airplanes in general, hey, you're gonna love this channel, so why not subscribe to it? I'm really trying to grow the channel in terms of subscribers. That's it for this video. Time to get to work on the propeller. Thanks for watching.